Hey guys, what's going on? I read 46 books this year, not quite reaching my goal of 52, but still a number I'm definitely proud of. We're gonna go pretty fast and loose today, starting with the worst book I read this year, Voyage of the Basilisk by Marie Brennan. I talked about this one recently, probably not too much of a surprise. I wanted more dragons, and I think I came in at an awkward spot in this series. It is a beautiful book, though. It has some nice illustrations in there. Next we got The Buried Giant by Ishiguro. I read Never Let Me Go and I was floored by it, so this might be a case of overhyped expectations. But it was mostly just a generic fantasy tale that maybe had some underlying meaning to it, but maybe not. Forgettable. Next we got The Earth is Near by Ludek Pesek, the worst science fiction book I read this year. Very pulpy, man versus Mars, man versus space dust, nothing new, nothing very interesting. Next, we got Death of a Salesman by Arthur Miller. I never officially reviewed this book on the channel because when I read it, I just wanted to forget about it. It was very depressing. It put me in a dark spot. I know it's a literary masterpiece, but I think I said in my last roundup video, I just kind of want to forget about this book, which is why it's at the bottom of the list. Oh, very similarly, The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. That's a tough one to swallow, especially when I read it. There was other things going on YouTube actually that kind of heightened the depressing aspects of it. So again, I know it's a literary masterwork and it was very beautifully written, very fanciful, but I want it to die at the bottom of this list, and hopefully it will. The Power and the Glory by Graham Greene. This one was not quite as well written. It was a bit clunky. It did have a satisfying old literary vibe, kind of like Hemingway, but I didn't quite get what he was trying to tell me, so it was frustrating and a bit boring. I'm gonna get some hate for this one. The Dying Earth by Jack Vance. Might be another case of overhyped expectations because Bookpilled loved it, so I thought I would love it as well. A bit too fantasy on the sci-fi fantasy spectrum. It had a nice vibe to it, but there wasn't enough to sink my teeth into. I was kind of just hovering on the periphery of this cool theme. Picnic at Hanging Rock by Joan Lindsay. Another one that by the end I wasn't sure what I was supposed to get out of it. It had some interesting aspects. I did like a few of the characters. Apparently it's an Australian literary masterpiece, so it was interesting to get a slice of that. But by the end I just had this kind of unnerved vibe, which maybe was the full intent. So perhaps I got what I should have out of that book. Lake Wobegon Days by Garrison Keillor. None of the jokes really landed. Once I started listening to the audiobook, I enjoyed it a lot more, mostly because of the delivery. It had a lot of quaint stories, some of them borderline Vonnegut stories. I do remember a few of them, but ultimately kind of dull, kind of forgettable. They Walked Like Men by Clifford D. Simak. I like this book, and I think we're getting into the territory of books that I enjoyed, which was, luckily, most of the books I read this year. This one was very pulpy, kind of had this comedic feel to it. Completely inoffensive, extremely readable, beautiful purple book, which probably should have gotten it up on the list just by that alone. To Your Scattered Bodies Go by Philip Jose Farmer. This one came highly recommended. It had a really cool idea, and as I learned afterwards, all of the characters in here were actually real-world people and were sent to this strange, interesting afterlife. But it left a really bad taste in my mouth because of the cliffhanger at the end. I know there's a sequel. I know the guy wants me to read the sequel, but you have to answer some of the questions in the first book, I think. Shadow of Heaven by Bob Shaw. I just read this one recently. Very quintessentially pulp, which I enjoy, which helped me get out of a reading slump I was in. Had a lot of cool aspects to it. A world where there's no more fertile ground, so we have to build this floating farmland, but ultimately probably pretty forgettable. The Book of Skulls by Robert Silverberg. I think I rated this one pretty highly back when I reviewed it, and I did not consult my mid-year review video before doing this one. I didn't want any previous bias to carry over. This book does seem to have something for everyone. Well, not really. It has something for most men, I'd say. There's no female representation, but a pretty deep dive into a couple of different mindsets. Interesting ideas, a little depressing at times, a little existential at times. Definitely not the best Silverberg I've read. The Pearl by John Steinbeck. A nice, condensed, slim little classic. I think I read it on a single plane ride. A story about the corrupting aspect of money, which I really don't need any more reminders of. Britt Marie Was Here by Frederick Bachman. I read A Man Called Ove last year, and this was just a rehash of that with a different character, which was fine, which I enjoyed. But when I was compiling all my books to talk about in this video, I forgot about this one. So a book that I forgot about reading probably shouldn't be very high on the list, right? Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving and a couple other stories in there. I read this at the peak of fall. It was perfectly themed. And a lot of the other lesser known stories, there's Rip Van Winkle, which was a good one, but even some of his like personal essays were interesting and relevant to modern times. I don't know what else Washington Irving wrote. I know he was a short story guy, but if he did write some other novel, I should look into that. Rendezvous with Rama by Arthur C. Clarke, kind of sparse by today's standards, but he did manage to write a really interesting, bizarre world inside of this spaceship. The Last Wish, which is one of the Witcher novels by Sapkowski. I played The Witcher 3 and I love The Witcher 3, so even me not being a fantasy person, I got a lot of enjoyment out of this one. Short stories, morally ambiguous, pretty good stuff. The Moat in God's Eye by the Larry Jerry Dream Team. This was another one that came highly recommended by Bookpilled, and another one I did not like as much as he did. I felt it was kind of heavy. I felt like there was a lot of storylines that I didn't really care about. The aliens were awesome. I wanted to know everything about the aliens. If they were talking about them, I was involved. If they weren't, I wasn't. So I feel like it deserved to be in the middle of this list. But I'm going to get a lot of hate for putting Red Shirts by John Scalzi right above that one. Obviously a totally different kind of book. This one's not trying to be hard science fiction. It's supposed to be lighthearted. It's supposed to be funny. It's supposed to be an easy read. And it was. I am a fan of John Scalzi, but I have seen a disproportionate amount of hate for him on YouTube in general. The Moviegoer by Walker Percy, a totally random book I picked up at Goodwill. Main character's name is Jack, and it's set in New Orleans where I used to live, so that was enough for me to pick it up. Not quite sure what this was saying, even after having read it. Something about the disintegration of religion and where that leaves a person morally in the world. Perhaps, maybe not. Should probably look at Goodreads, see what other people had to say about that one. Norwegian Wood by Murakami. A beautiful book, but very depressing, and I think I read it at the wrong time. He's got a lot to say, and a lot of it I agree with. He has a very casual writing style, very readable. I will read more of him, but I do have to be careful when I read it and where my emotions currently are. God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater by Kurt Vonnegut. A story about capitalism, a story about wealth, a story about empathy, humanity. That could be said for all Vonnegut novels, probably. I watched the Outlaw Bookseller recently talk about Vonnegut, and he said you can overdo Vonnegut easily. And he's right, and I think I overdid Vonnegut this year. I read 5 books of his, all of which are, of course, on this list. Because his books are very similar. They have the same themes, obviously wildly different plots, but I think ultimately he's saying the same thing in a lot of them. And of course he is very heavy, so when you read a couple in a row, you are left with this weight in your chest that's kind of hard to swallow. There's another Kurt Vonnegut, Mother Night, which I put slightly above God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, but really this kind of fits in the same slot. Slightly less impactful, slightly less cohesive than the other ones. This one's about World War II. There's a double agent who's working for the US, but puts out propaganda for Germany, and when the war is over and the guy goes back to the US, everyone thinks he's a villain because he put out propaganda for Germany, and they're kind of right, but they're kind of wrong. An interesting idea, very ambiguous. Here's a book of short stories, the very best of fantasy and science fiction. Hard to put this one in with the others because there's so many names on them, a lot of them big names. I think I read Cordwainer Smith for the first time. There was a story about a giant baby destroying a town. Harlan Ellison's famous story was in here, which was meh. But I like to break up novels with short stories every now and then. This was the only anthology I read this year though, which was kind of odd. Let's try to read more next year. Valis by Philip K. Dick, the only Dick I read this year, which is surprising. This one was okay, I thought. The story of a guy who receives God's knowledge through the form of a pink light through his eye. Classic stuff about the malleability of reality and how all of society is kind of organized insanity, I guess is how I'll sum that one up. The Shrinking Man by Richard Matheson. I finally picked up a non-Will Smith edition of I Am Legend to read because I really like this author. I think we're in tune in some kind of masculine solitude kind of feel. This book was very raw. This book was very real, and I felt it in a way that not a lot of other books reach me. Sounds very cryptic. In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, absolute masterpiece, and I think I can say that now we're in the top 20. It really sheds light on a lot of aspects of humanity that maybe you'd rather not look at, but once you see them, it's kind of undeniable. So it was another heavy read, but his writing style kind of made it easier. He has a knack for dialogue, and he has a knack for creating these true-to-life characters that you can really picture and you can really hear. I just read Breakfast at Tiffany's, actually, which was a very, very different book, but writing style still spot on. Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, science fiction classic, the science fiction classic, I guess you could say. It is crazy to think how long ago this was written and how relevant it still is and how readable it still is. It's a little bit clunky, and a large part of this is describing how sad someone is. But for good reason. There is a powerful message in this book that is still relevant today. And I'm going to get a lot of hate for putting Artemis by Andy Weir just above Frankenstein. Obviously, very different intention with these two books. This one's just a good time out in space, on the moon, and maybe some of the characters are cheesy, and maybe some of the plot is very predictable, but it was a good time. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed myself. I'm a big Andy Weir fan. Player Piano by Kurt Vonnegut. I know this was his first book, so it's strange to have it above those other two, but the content of this is super relevant to today. It's talking about AI and automation and the price you pay for injecting that into a society. Perhaps people will say it's a bit alarmist and you can't compare it, but I saw a lot of truth in this book, and I recommend it to anyone, honestly. Fifth Business by Robertson Davies, the highest ranked Penguin classic on the list. I thought the story was very engaging. I thought the message was very clear and one that could be applicable to anyone. It's about your past, and it's about being able to stare your past in the face, even if it hurts, even if it's scary, because in order to know yourself now, you need to know your past. Robertson Davies wrote two others, and this is part of a trilogy, which I find hard to believe, but I do have the other two. Eager to read those in 2024. Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke, obviously an all-time sci-fi masterpiece. Actually, when I reviewed this on the channel, my mom called me and said, hey, even I read that book. A lot of interesting ideas, a lot of twists and turns. Begins with an ambiguous alien invasion. You're not sure what they're here for. I'm always in for that kind of story. Glad that one made top 15. Where are we at here? Number 13, Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut. A lot of people say this is his best book, and I wouldn't agree with that, but it's definitely one of his best, and it's one of his most accessible beyond Slaughterhouse-5. It's about a biological weapon called Ice-9, which threatens to turn all of the water on Earth into ice, which the military is interested in. I think it's got all the classic Vonnegut themes. He's talking about tribalism, he's talking about empathy, he's talking about what holds the world together, as in A Cat's Cradle. Of course, that's up for debate. There's a lot of themes, there's a lot of messages you can get out of this, and in my opinion, they are all good. Number 12, The World Inside by Robert Silverberg. This is the best Silverberg I've read of all time, I guess, but I've only ever read Silverberg this year. It's about an overpopulated world where everyone has to live in these monads, and I'm surprised I remember that term, and that speaks to how good this book was. But everyone lives in these giant cities, and their one thrill is reproduction. He does have a background as an erotic writer, so you might know where that's going. Number 11, City by Clifford D. Simak. Surprisingly not the best Simak I read this year, spoilers, but a very entertaining one that involves talking dogs and talking squirrels. I actually didn't agree with him at the end of this, what he was saying about human evolution, but I have to agree that it's a really well-written book. It's actually a series of interconnected stories, which sometimes I'm hit or miss on, but he did well here to actually make me feel like I read something cohesive, which can be hard to do. And it's a beautiful book too. I love this specific edition of it with the dog on the front and just the nice green color that you know I love. And here we go, the top 10 books I read this year, starting with The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse. A beautiful story, a heartwarming story, universal. I don't care who you are, you're gonna get something out of this. And how many books can you really say that's true of? I included this in a giveaway earlier this month because I knew whoever got it would appreciate it. If you haven't read it, there might be a copy in my eBay store. Shameless plug. Check it out. Very giftable as well. Number 9, The City and the Stars by Arthur C. Clarke. First of all, cover art on point. Second of all, beautiful message about being open to change. Even if generations and generations before you have done it a certain way, that doesn't mean you have to do it that way. Kind of a generic message, kind of a generic book, but I don't know. It hit me right. And that's what this list is about, right? Number 8, The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. Similar to The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse, a universal message. If you read this and you don't feel something, you might be dead. I'm sure everyone has heard of this book or has already read this book, but if you haven't, then read it, for sure. Number 7, City of Illusions by Ursula K. Le Guin. This one's a bit pulpy. I'm not sure it will stand the test of time because I just finished it and it just got me out of a reading slump. So I think it will always hold a special, very subjective place in my heart and on my shelf. But that's not to take away from the book. An interesting world, a journey of self-discovery, Philip K. Dick vibes of reality shaping and pulling the wool over your eyes. I love Le Guin. You know I love Le Guin. And I'm glad I picked this one up because the last Le Guin I tried to read was Lavinia, and I couldn't get into it, which was a bit alarming because I thought I loved everything that she'd ever written. But back on track. And I do have more of hers on my TBR. Number 6, The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. You may be noticing a trend here at the top of the list of very uplifting, very positive books. I think I read a lot of heavy stuff, so I need counterbalances like this. This one really hit for me. I know a lot of people think it's precocious, a lot of people think it's a bit, pretentious, and maybe it is, but if you're open to it, it really is magical. It makes you see the possibilities of the world, even ones that you may have hardened to long ago. It did it for me. I hope it does it for you. If it doesn't, I'm sorry. Number 5. Here it is, the best Clifford D. Simak book I read this year, Waystation. A lot of people love this book. Similar to Richard Matheson, I think this author just speaks to me. We have a similar mindset, and I can sense the authenticity in what he's telling me. It's very humanitarian. There's a sense of loneliness to it. There is a sense of being separate from your race, your species, that I understand, and that I think Richard Matheson would really understand. Beautiful book, beautiful message in a small, pulpy, vintage sci-fi frame. Absolutely love this book. Here is definitely the biggest surprise on this list. Number 4, Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel. I read Station 11 and I was mixed on it. I couldn't quite overcome the fact that there wasn't a solid plot. And it took me a while to come to terms with what it meant to be a novel of theme. But I must have succeeded because this book hit me the right way. There was a lot of different storylines in this book, a lot of different messages and a lot of different themes, but they did all come together in what I can't quite call cohesive, but cohesive enough for me to remember the feel. The ending, I have to admit, was predictable, especially if you read a lot of vintage science fiction, but this book did it for me. I connected with this modern sci-fi book, and that is a rarity, and that is enough to earn it this spot high on the list. Number 3, another surprise. This one definitely climbed the ranks from the mid-year review. Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. It's a beautiful story about overcoming adversity and being the light in the darkness, even when nobody else is. It's a world that's been consumed with famine and everyone is clawing at each other's heels to survive. And it's about, even in that kind of society, even in that kind of circumstance, remaining positive, remaining optimistic, and remaining a part of the solution. And that really stuck with me, and that has actually grown since I read this book. I know there's a sequel, Parable of the Talents, and I remember finishing this saying like, yeah, maybe I'll read that, maybe I won't. And it's definitely the sign of a good book that grows on you, that becomes better over time. So I think I have sold Parable of the Talents on my eBay store, unfortunately, so be looking for another copy of that. Number 2, the best Kurt Vonnegut book I've ever read, Sirens of Titan. This has everything I love about Vonnegut. It has a lot of familiar themes, has a lot of familiar messages in a science fiction shell that really goes all over the place. There's a Martian invasion, there's a new religion, and there's a character, much like Slaughterhouse-Five, that gets taken by the hand and just smeared through the whole thing. It's entertaining, it's devastating, it's a little depressing ultimately, but Vonnegut at his best. And yes, as you can see, I read 5 Vonnegut books this year, which was, I'm going to say, too many. Definitely going to taper off for next year because there's only so many, and that's kind of a sad thought in itself. All right, the best book I read this year out of 46 books, Never Cry Wolf by Farley Moat. I have to say this is my wife's favorite book. It's been her favorite book for a long time, and I finally read it this year, so it's hard to compete with that kind of recommendation. And to have the enthusiasm and the hype of the person I love and trust most in this world, and for it to deliver. It's about a biologist who's dropped in northern Canada to study the wolf population. And I've always been a hiker, I've always been a backpacker, I've always been an outdoorsy person. So it was the perfect adventure for me to live vicariously. Amazing escapism. I could put myself so easily in his shoes. It's entertaining and informative and pretty short. I read it in 2 sittings, I think. I wish I could read it again. I wish there was more of it. I actually just picked up a book called The Snow Leopard by Peter Matthiessen. Similar idea about a guy going into the wilderness to study the snow leopard. I'm hoping it's the same thing, but we will see. And that's what I got for you. Those are all of the 46 books I read this year. And it's my first time doing it in this public book journal YouTube format, which has been eye-opening in a lot of ways. It has been a pleasure to have everyone watch and comment and like and share what they agree with and what they disagree with. It has helped round me out as a person, which is why I read in the first place, which is why I think a lot of people read, to have that large sample size of humanity and to see life through other people's eyes. And I think YouTube is just another way for me to do that. So again, thank you, everyone. I do appreciate it. I hope you all had a good reading year as well, and I hope you have another good one in 2024. So, as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.